Very much for joining us today. Next up, Ray Moore, running for South Carolina Lieutenant Governor. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. There are several preachers on the platform. You may wonder why so many are getting involved in the political process. I'm not the only one. It's because we're very concerned about the spiritual future of our nation. We're concerned about the future of our children. In 1977, my wife and I started an experiment in education. We were one of the first homeschool families in the modern era. I was finishing up theological seminary in Indiana at Grace Seminary, and we were facing what were we going to do with our 6-year-old son. Were we going to put him in a public school or a private Christian school? Funds were an issue, and we also were concerned a little bit about the lack of rigor, academic rigor in the Christian schools. In those days, homeschooling didn't exist. But my wife and I talked and prayed, and I can still remember the day very well when she said, "I think I can do it." And so we started a family school, and we proceeded over the next few years to homeschool all of our children, usually up through the middle school years. Our oldest son graduated from the Citadel in 1993. He was one of the early homeschooled children to go through college in a modern era. I hope I'm okay to say that he graduated valedictorian of the Citadel in 1993. He was also the cadet colonel and regimental commander. I have to tell you, it was a very unusual day that I got to give the benediction and invocation for his graduation ceremony. And the Citadel has a wonderful tradition of allowing graduates to award their children their diplomas. So I got to award his diploma, and President Ronald Reagan was the commencement speaker. You couldn't have made it up if you tried. So we had a wonderful experience with our children. All of them were faithful Christians, successful in life, active in their churches. And so in 1997, I went to an important event in Washington, D.C., where all the conservative groups gathered together to discuss what are we going to do about Goals 2000 and School to Work and the outcome-based education agenda. And I sat there for a day with 400 or 500 people listening to speakers on how we needed to repeal this system, and there was a wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth. Oh, isn't it awful? What are we going to do about education in America? This was in February of 1997. And as I listened, I realized that our best leaders and conservative leaders, Christian leaders, no one had a plan. No one had an idea of what to do. And I walked out of that meeting that day and I said, with the help of the Lord, I'm going to get several million children out of these public schools. 1997, November, I offered the Exodus Mandate Project. That is a ministry, a Christian ministry, to get Christian families to take up Christian schools or homeschooling, not public schooling, or as I like to say, Pharaoh schools. Additionally, it's our hope and prayer that a fresh obedience by Christian families in educating their children according to biblical commands will prove to be a key for the revival of our families, our churches, and our nation. We cannot win this war we're in as long as we keep handing our children over to the enemy to educate. All of the symptoms and the things that we're fighting and complaining about today have been caused because the culture has changed. The culture has turned against God, against our Constitution, and against traditional values. Why has that happened? It's fundamentally and largely responsible because of the public school system. We've had 6 or 7 generations where most of us have put our children in the godless pagan school system. It cannot be fixed. It's a socialistic model, and we need to abandon that. As conservatives and Christians, if you think you're going to win this war you're in and leave your children in those schools, it will not happen. We created a movie 2 years ago. I'm the executive producer, called Indoctrination, and the subtitle is Public Schools and the Decline of Christianity in America. We can trace the decline of Christianity and traditional values and even the loss of our constitutional belief to public education. They are converting our children. 70 to 80% of committed Christian children who stay in the public school system through their entire career, 70 to 80% of those children from our kind of families are abandoning the church and abandoning the Christian faith in their early adult years, and only 20% ever return. We are losing because we have handed our own children over to the enemy. In 1453, the city of Constantinople, the last bastion of Greek Orthodoxy, fell to the Ottoman Empire and the Muslims. Prior to that, for 20 years or so, the Muslims had extracted tribute by having Christian families hand over one of their sons. This was the way they kept the Islamic Muslims at bay. And at the pivotal, and the Muslims took these Christian boys, raised them as strong Muslims, and then they made them into an elite fighting unit called the Janissaries. They were called the Janissaries. And at the critical moment in the battle for Christian civilization in Constantinople in 1453, when these heroic Christian men and their sons and brothers were fighting to preserve their civilization, the Ottoman Empire sent in the Janissaries, the crack elite unit of their own children. And when they saw their sons, they wilted, their morale broke, and the city fell. We are doing that today. Hillary Clinton, who may be the next president, God forbid, was raised in a conservative Republican family, and she was a Goldwater girl in high school. There's an example of a Janissary. We are turning many of our own children over to this system. We've got to come to terms with the reality that we must remove our children from the public system, the state, or the government schools, and educate them in private, Christian, and homeschooling if we're serious about winning this war. Thank you.